Does this bloody work? Okay. At least it obscures my face if it doesn't project my voice. I'd like to be the first to rush to the common ground that's just been offered us, which consists of a very large and quite long admission that religion is man-made, which is our point to begin with. Thank you.
I wanted to veer a little bit back towards the afterlife, or forward to the afterlife, and say, we talked a little bit about that we don't know what happens, and there could be this sense of consciousness existing out of our bodies. Isn't religion, all these concepts of an afterlife, can't we just talk of it in terms of metaphor and kind of agree that religion is the best metaphor, or has provided some metaphors for what the rest of us would call an afterlife? Is that what it amounts to?
I think there's some confusion here. I think there's a real asymmetry between science and religion that shouldn't go unobserved. And there's an effort on the part of David and Bradley to not own the very clear propositional claims that have been made by every religion for millennia. Claims about the way the universe is structured. Very explicit claims about what's going to happen in the future, about what happened in the past, about what happens after death. And these claims are incompatible. So, for instance, if Buddhism is true, Buddhism purports to be true. Buddhism has a doctrine of karma and rebirth. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in various realms. If Buddhism is true, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are absolutely false in their core claims. I mean, these are not pictures that can be squared logically. And every religion is in the business of making these claims about the afterlife and about all manner of other things. And the crucial difference between religion and science is that every religion is beholden to its literature and doesn't think, for the most part, apart from the fringe of kind of liberal intelligentsia, for the most part, people don't think it's man-made. They don't think that these are just books. If everyone read the Bible like Shakespeare, Hitch and I would be doing something entirely unrecognizable right now. I mean, there would be no problem. And so the problem we're articulating is everyone has this idea that they have knowledge about the afterlife, the end of days, the virgin birth of certain people, etc. And these are claims to truth, and they are profoundly anti-scientific because you can't edit the books. You can't edit the Quran. You can't edit the Bible. You can't acknowledge freely within the context of the faith that there are just mountains of life-destroying nonsense in these books, and that's a problem.
So talk a little bit, then we'll move on to the next. Yeah, give a brief.
Okay, I want to just say this, that it is undeniable what Sam said about the fact that there are truth claims in different traditions that contradict each other. But here's what I think ought not to go unnoticed. I've been at any number, as almost every clergy has at one time or another, I've been at any number of interfaith conferences. I was just spoke at an interfaith conference in San Diego on labor in different traditions, okay? And it was everything from Native American, there was a Native American dance, there was a Buddhist chant, there was a reading from the Quran, you know, and the Jew talked. So it was a true interfaith conference. And here's what was so interesting about the time that we all spent before we went out on stage to do our dances, either literal or metaphorical. We were all talking about our traditions. We all understood that there were serious differences about part of it, and everybody there, I think in all sincerity, and not just to be nice, agreed that there was a profound core of similarity in these religious traditions, that we saw the world as more than material, that we saw human beings as having a sacred destiny, not only an occupational destiny, that we thought that kindness and goodness was the mandate of whatever force we understood to run the world. I mean, these are serious, and they are truth claims, but they're truth claims that are outside the realm of science. Science can't decide whether there is, in fact, a sacred destiny to your life. It doesn't ask those kinds of questions or give those kinds of answers. Religion does. And the day that you say that all of religion is off the table because, after all, it says in Genesis that the world was created in 7 days and we know that's not true, then what you do is you throw out the very serious, comprehensive, and shared questions of meaning of human life that really, really matter to the way people live, and that you ought not to do.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what evidence there is for an afterlife, because when you read books about it, it inevitably comes up that people purport there to be evidence. So I wanted you all to share your thoughts on that. One of the most common tropes is the near-death experience. Yeah. There have been, I think, over the last 3 decades, there's been 40 studies of some 3,400 near-death experiences, and they've been published in journals like Lancet and Annals of American Psychological Journals. And Barbara Haggerty did a book on this called Fingerprints of God, where she interviewed a lot of the people who did these studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and a lot of the people she interviewed said that they cannot help but think, after investigating these in a scientific way, that they point to something beyond this life.
I would say almost that was wrong by definition, because it's a near-death experience. It means you didn't die.
But it's the best we have.
No. If someone is reported dead on Tuesday and you see them on Friday, the overwhelming, well, not the obvious conclusion is that the initial report was mistaken. We have no reason to think otherwise. I've read a lot about this stuff. In fact, I have two. If you care to get the Portable Atheist, which I edited, there are 2 accounts by great philosophers, the late A.J. Ayer, and fortunately very current Daniel Dennett, about their own so-called near-death hospital experiences of people who were battling with very grave onslaughts on their health, which I recommend you read for the very confirming rationality that they bring to it. Dinesh D'Souza, who's a frequent debating partner of mine, has written a book about this too, and the most persuasive example from any hospital he's found, and I get it all the time, is a woman who floated out of her body, out of the bed, made a tour of the outside of the hospital,
saw the shoe,
noticed that there was a running shoe on one of the windowsills, woke up, reported it to a nurse whose name we've never been told, and who went and looked, and there was the shoe. Now, if that doesn't prove it, I don't know what does. I could hardly be more reassured if I'd been told that it was able to reunite it with its missing pair. NDE is bullshit. It doesn't count. It's not coming back from the dead, nor is it an account of what happens to you when you're gone. It's what can happen to you with the help of life-preserving scientific medicine while you are still alive.
I would just add one thing. This kind of question is still scientifically tractable. People have, reasonably serious people, have tried to study the near-death experience. And this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociated from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable. And so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, I saw this weird digital readout above your cabinets, and it was 35721. That would be very interesting. Now, no one to my knowledge has done that, but if people, this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines, but again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
It's about as good
it's
as the people.
It's testable, and there's no data there.
Yeah. But people are just as convinced that they used in past lives to be. It always tends to be a princess, you notice, or a charioteer, or something of this sort. It's as real to them as the rest of their pathetic lives are. But it's subjective, and it's wish fulfilling, and it doesn't count. I'm actually a bit amazed we haven't got to wish fulfillment yet. Could I say a word about that? I mean, Freud, in his Future of an Illusion, says that the connection between our desires and our beliefs in the case of the afterlife is so obvious. It's mankind's oldest and most strong dread. maybe we could duck the fate that appears to be in store for us. That it's unlike any belief that Sam and I can offer you. Maybe all kinds of discrepancies between scientific views. We cannot promise you things of this kind, as religion always has to people. It doesn't make us morally superior, but it does mean, and we're not particularly happy with what we propose, which is overwhelmingly likely that annihilation and extinction await us. It's just that the overwhelming weight of evidence seems that way. Now, again, to quote Dinesh, he said to me once, well, I can see why people want heaven for themselves, and that's wish-fulfilling, and eternal life, even though I think that's a horrible idea myself, but still. But why do they want hell? Why would a wish fulfiller invent the inferno? Well, I think that's pretty obvious. It's for other people to go to. A very old rhyme among English Calvinists was, we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crowned. In fact, in the work of many early church fathers, I'm so glad to find, by the way, that anything written in the first century by religious people doesn't count. And I wish that more ministers of religion would make that concession. But Tertullian and many other Christian fathers thought that one of the pleasures of heaven, because it's always been rather hard to describe them, you ever noticed that? Eating foie gras to the sound of trumpets was the Reverend Sidney Smith's best shot. We know what the Muslims think for men. Apparently for women, do you know what they get? They get their husbands back.
Is that heaven?
Nothing man-made about that, right? But the church, at least the Christian church, said no. One of the pleasures of paradise is surveying and relishing the torments of the damned. When we talk about wish fulfillment, we're talking about the very unpleasant primate species to which we belong, and the self-interested fantasies that it will continue to generate. One of which is really...
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Two things to say here. The first, I need to confess to the audience. My mother, the atheist, the Freudian psychoanalyst atheist, wants me to tell you that she's rooting for you guys. And the two can play at that kind of clever and cute trick. So you confess that the idea of an afterlife is a hideous idea. Well, of course there's a wish fulfillment involved in hoping that we're not accountable and that at the end it's all over. So one can pathologize the other viewpoint, but it's unworthy of you. It seems to me that the test in Jewish tradition is not another person's theology, but their behavior. And that unethical behavior is to be condemned, even if it comes from a good atheist, just as it is to be condemned by someone who claims to cloak it in religious rhetoric. So here's the last religious thing I want to say. At the very core of traditional Judaism is the notion of bechirah, of choice, which means no miracle is so unambiguous that it can't be explained away as secular, and no miracle is so overwhelming that you have to accept it. So you have a perfect example of that. We have this data that suggests that the mind has a far greater range than we have previously admitted that it has. My autistic son is capable of hearing through walls. He'll listen in school to 2 classrooms down, and accurately, we've checked, report what that teacher was saying when his teacher was too boring to listen to. Don't we all wish our brains could do that? And so the expanse of the mind is far beyond what we have described it as being capable of being. So one can look at this data and say, this looks to me like intimations that we do in some key and important way have consciousness that is mediated through our minds, but is not limited to our brains. And then it's equally plausible to say, until you're dead, you have no business talking about it. It does feel to me that the irrelevant aspect of this, and the Freudian in me looks at the animus here and says that's what needs to be accounted for, is that for many of us, hope in an afterlife grounds us and gives us direction. And the notion that my grandmother and I are not eternally separate is a source of great and abiding comfort to me.
Do you believe you'll see her?
If by see, you want me to walk into something literal.
Well, you just said you're not eternally separate. I don't know what you mean.
I'm using a metaphor because I think we are packets of energy. Look, I get that from physics as well. We are packets of energy, and I don't think those packets of energy are necessarily limited to our body. And the last thing I have to say, just to clear my reputation here, at no point did I say that first century literature was irrelevant. What I said is it's not meant to be taken literally.
I want to piggyback on what Brad said.
That's not what it said.
We've gone around this several times. Almost every time that Christopher and I have debated, which is now several times, I've made this same point, but obviously to no effect. So either the point is not good or the point is not good. But I want to make it anyway. Listen, when someone explains their own beliefs by reason and explains your belief by psychology, you actually don't have to listen to them. Because this is what happens to religious people all the time. I'm an atheist because I'm strong and rational and thoughtful. You're about wish fulfillment. And therefore, religious people are by definition weaker, less sophisticated. We understand, you shouldn't be religious, but I understand you need it. There are people who believe in the afterlife who are weak and fearful, and people who believe in the afterlife who are courageous and strong. There are atheists who are weak and fearful. There are atheists who are courageous and strong. It is an unworthy argument to say that someone believes in something because of wish fulfillment as opposed to someone believes in something because it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. That's not the way you ought to argue about religion or anything else.
Bradley just said that his belief in an afterlife is predicated on the effect this belief has in his life. It gives him hope. He finds it immensely consoling.
Is that why you believe in the afterlife? I'm just curious.
No, but it is one of the benefits of it.
Okay,
right.
so
it has a consequence, but that doesn't mean that that's what. Look, I find it enormously consoling and wonderful to think that my daughter loves me. But I don't believe it because I find it enormously consoling. I believe it because she does.
Okay.
She's a teenager.
You do, right? Okay, just a little empirical verification there.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife or that the mind is identical to the brain,
right,
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces. You can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
David?
And I think a much more important point is if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
And I'm sorry to say, David, that your shorthand account of our disagreement is a little
self-serving.
A little deceptive. I mean, if you say to me of yourself that the fact that I hold a belief that makes me feel better has nothing to do with why I hold the belief, I might just believe it from you, I suppose. But Freud isn't as crude as you make him sound. He said that to ask people to accept that humanity's oldest fear, that of death, and oldest wish, that of the ability to survive it, has nothing to do with the faith in an afterlife. It's only a coincidence if it makes people feel better. I'm not going to accept that, and you shouldn't be putting it about either. Yeah.
David, you didn't get a chance to respond to the near-death. Does that have any impact on your beliefs?
Well, I'll just say this about near-death experiences. First of all, I would love, I wouldn't like to have one, but I'd love to have one. And I've been operated on several times with the sad result of having nothing other than unconsciousness during the operation. But 8 million people have reported these near-death experiences, according to a Gallup poll in '92, so presumably others have had it since then. The sort of William James pragmatic test of whether an experience is real is that, in fact, many of them report that they no longer fear death, that their lives have radically changed as a result of it. And the only thing I would say is, do I say that this is proof that there's an afterlife? My answer is no, but. And here's the but. There's this philosopher named Jackson, I think Fred Jackson, who proposed the following experiment. Dennett's commented on it. I don't know if either of you have, but I'd be curious to know what you think. He said, look, let's say you had a brilliant scientist in a room with a black and white television in a black and white room, and the only thing she ever saw was black and white. And she became the world's expert. Her name is Mary in his experiment. She became the world's expert on the physiology of vision. She knew everything about vision, about the neuroscience of vision, about the way the retina works, and so on. She knew as much as it is possible to be known. Now, he said, imagine that you turn on the television and it's in color. Has she learned something? In other words, is there something you learn from experience that is not reducible to intellection? And my sense is yes. She would have learned something if all of a sudden she saw colors that she could not have known if she was an expert in the neuroscience of color. Someone who has a near-death experience is saying to us, I actually learned something from the experience that you can't reduce to this is some kind of trick that we don't understand yet that your brain did. I'm not willing to say that it's proof of the afterlife, but I'm also not willing to dismiss it with a few laughs and say that all the millions of people who had this experience and have felt that it gave them important information about life are wrong and foolish.
How does the 8 billion stack up against the people who've been inseminated by UFOs or their pilots?
Well, I think there's probably some overlap.
Or the many. Let me tell you something. Or the many. I don't know. It's certainly nothing compared to those who've seen the Virgin Mary's statues move or bleed. Nothing like.
But does that mean you believe that they, in fact, didn't have such an experience? Is that what you're saying?
No, it is that their experiences are real to me, to them. All I ask is that they keep it to themselves if they possibly can. No, I mean, I knew very well a man named Hugh Montefiore, who was one of the only 2 Jewish boys at an English boarding school, until one day Jesus of Nazareth came into his room and said, "Follow me," which he did for the rest of his life. He ended up as a very senior member of the Church of England, a bishop, in fact. In fact, the Bishop of Birmingham, which, by the way, is the first line of a limerick. And acted throughout as if that was as real to him as anything could be, and wrote some very interesting books indeed. And terribly upset the only other Jewish boy in that school who was left as the only other Jew. But yes, of course I have to grant that these things are real to him. I'm not sure I believe that the mass visions of weeping and bleeding statues are as real. I think there's a lot of collective hallucination
Right. Well,
involved. And if you ask people to draw what the Virgin looks like when they've only had a vision of her, it's always like the last icon that they saw.
I'm not saying that we should fall down every time terracotta gets wet. I mean, that's not my statement here, and I don't believe in weeping statues. But you anthologized two of these experiences. It's just that people gave them different interpretations of them. So I have to think that you actually take these experiences seriously. There's nothing in the Portable Atheist about visions of the Virgin Mary crying, but you put Ayer and Dennett's experience in there. They didn't necessarily think that it proved something about the afterlife, but you must have credited the experiences enough to put it in your book.
Well, sure, because anything that suggests that people are having... NDEs are pretty new, and so are a large number of medical and life-prolonging techniques. I think that's interesting enough in itself. That people can now live long enough or be well-tended enough to have experiences of consciousness that we haven't even begun to study yet. Yes, that of course deserves to be taken seriously. But the people who say, oh, all that does, it's not really new, all it proves is what we already knew from the first vision or from the first promise of the divine, are doing what religion always does, assimilating what they can of the discoveries that would otherwise make nonsense of it.
It occurs to me as you're both talking that both of you have faced serious illness in your lives, and I'm wondering if that at all has shaped your view of the afterlife. David?
I actually don't think so. No. It neither mitigated my terror, nor did it, I think, reinforce my faith. I think that although I changed as a person, I don't think that I changed, at least I hope I changed as a person. I don't think I changed belief or the sense that people were more than stuff.
Christopher?
I would say it fractionally increases my contempt for the false consolation element of religion and my dislike for the dictatorial and totalitarian part of it. But I presume what I say by the first is self-evident. But what I mean by the second is it's considered perfectly normal in this society to approach dying people who you don't know, but who are unbelievers, and say, now are you going to change your mind? In fact, it's considered almost a polite question. And as you know, there's a long history of fraud about this. People claim that Darwin had a deathbed recantation. They'd made up lies about Thomas Paine. It goes on all the time. It's a very nasty little history, but there's also a horrible undertone of blackmail to it. People write and say, look, you've got about one chance left now. Aren't you going to take it? I'm writing to you as a friend. They've even tried it on me when I've been very ill and I haven't had quite the vinegar I'd like to have had in a hospital bed. I don't mind. I can take it. But I think there are a lot of people older than myself, iller than myself, perhaps at the risk of seeming conceited, less educated than myself, to whom that's a horrible experience. It's very depressing and alarming to be spoken to in that way. I mean, if Sam and I were to form a core of people to go around religious hospitals, which is what happens in reverse, and say to people who are lying in pain, say, did you say you were Catholic? Yes. Well, look, you may only have a few days left, but you don't have to live them as a serf, you know. Just recognize that was all bullshit, that the priests have been cheating you. And I guarantee you'll feel better. I don't think that would be very ethical.
Okay, but
I think it would be something of a breach of taste. But if it's in the name of if it's in the name of God, it has a social license. Well, fuck that, is what I say. And will say, if it's my last breath. Thank you.
Brad.
When I was 12, I had what the doctor incorrectly labeled as a terminal inoperable cancer. And the first procedure by which they discovered that was as humiliating a medical procedure as a 12-and-a-half-year-old boy could possibly go through. And raised in a good atheist home, and I don't mean that with any irony, I mean a good atheist home, I had this vision with my eyes of Moses and the children of Israel going through the split sea. Being that I was a good atheist, that passed. It turns out that the terminal sentence was a bit of an exaggeration. So I recovered. The disease came back twice. I've survived it thus far, although I'm a rabbi, so there is some long-term consequence that's debilitating. I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, walked into someone's room, and she said, looking at this little 25-year-old kid, you know, what the hell can you possibly say to me? You've never had cancer. And I blurted out, I did too, which was the first time I ever consciously was aware that I had had cancer, even though I had gone to cancer wards or whatever. My point here is that mystical experience did not make me a believer. I didn't have a thing to put it on until I became a believer for other reasons. And then I remembered it and went, oh yeah, there was something there. So the challenge I would like to make is I think that in some important way, we really need to become allies. If you'd like to see me as a psychologist, and I need you to write a short note to my mother before the evening is out, because that will please her no end. You know, I also want to say that I think that that kind of militant literalism is equally offensive and problematic on both sides. I don't recognize myself, and I will say here in this audience that neither Rabbi Wolpe nor I are marginal to the religious experience of the Jewish community here. So that may be both good news and bad news for you. It means you actually have what I think of as secular religious people who are your allies in everything except for the finish line, and that may hurt book sales.
Well, it's to some degree an artifact of Judaism. This is not a problem that Christopher and I run into with evangelicals and Muslims. I mean, it is conceivable to be a Jew and be and a serious Jew, someone who takes their Judaism very seriously, and be even less religious than you are, and to say you don't believe in God, and that is just a frank contradiction within Christianity and Islam at the moment, and it was a frank contradiction certainly at some point in Judaism, and certainly Maimonides seemed to think it was. I think we can concede, however, that that belief in the afterlife, or at least a profession of belief in the afterlife, gives you something to say in the most difficult moments in life to others who are losing someone or who have lost someone. It gives you something to say that an atheist doesn't have, which, if believed by the one who has just lost their child, for instance, is really consoling. I mean, there is nothing better in terms of consolation than to believe that the child you just lost is now someplace perfect and you will be reunited.
Sam, what would you say? I mean, put yourself on the spot. If somebody in that moment asked you, I'm about to die, what's going to happen to me? What would you tell them?
Well, I mean, I think actually this issue of the one who dies is less. Our fear of death, at least as far as I can tell from a sample of one, is not of our own death. And we all go to sleep every night and just disappear. We lose everything. I mean, deep sleep for almost everyone is synonymous with oblivion. I mean, you lose your sensory experience. You forget your life. If you never woke up, you wouldn't notice it. And this is. Many people have noticed this, perhaps most famously the Roman poet Lucretius. If death is synonymous with non-existence, there really is nothing to fear, and slipping into it may feel just as satisfying as slipping into sleep. I mean, there's just that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about the process of dying, perhaps, I mean, the process of being ill and in pain, And we're really worried about losing the people we love while we're alive and having nothing to think that's consoling in the midst of that bereavement.
I'm really glad to have the chance to disagree with you.
Right.
The problem is quite other. I mean, half my sex life has been lived when I was unconscious. More than half.
What do you mean? You're talking about dreams?
And not all of that was nightmare either, which is a thing that really does oppress and distress a lot of people, which is as real to them as waking.
No, I wasn't talking about dreams. I was talking about deep sleep.
No, well, deep sleep.
You have to hold the mic close.
Deep sleep is where they come from, and this is why Hamlet is so well remembered, because when he speaks of the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, and he says, I can almost do it. Who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, if he himself could his quietus make with the bare bodkin. And he says, because in that sleep of death, what dreams might come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. When I speak about annihilation and extinction, I mean just that. I mean, the screen goes blank and that's it.
Right.
That's surely what makes people frightened.
Well, don't you think Lucretius had a point when he talked about...
You're not going to know you're dead, but when you're alive and you're in deep sleep, you can.
But, Hamlet says the exact opposite. He says, makes us bear those ills we have rather than fly to others we know not of. In other words, over there are going to be ills too. In other words, there is an afterlife.
Okay, but you're still talking about...
Oh, no. Well, his father's just come back from the afterlife.
So it's clear. All right, so...
Though he still wants some evidence in the next 3 scenes that was...
But can we... I have just
not an apparition.
Since I want to be peaceful about this,
yes.
Can we all agree that whether there's an afterlife or not, the point of life is to live in such a way that you deserve one?
Well, that would be true if there was no God.
I did my best.
Which I've already postulated. There could be no God and an afterlife, or an afterlife and no God. If there is a dictator who distributes reward and punishment, then you can never be sure if you're doing a right action or an action born out of fear, or the hope of reward. So no, it's an incitement in a way to immorality, certainly to servility, which is not a moral position to be occupied. No.
I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes here. I'm talking about unconsciousness, just the absolute cessation of any kind of experience. If the prototypical atheist is right, and you just get a dial tone at death, that is what people claim to fear. But as Lucretius pointed out, that is analogous to the time before your birth. You'll no more suffer the eternity after your death than you'll suffer the time before your birth. And there was a time where we're sitting was populated entirely by, I think, Chumash Indians. None of us were here. Okay, now what was that like? Not for the Chumash, for us. It didn't bother me.
I was a princess. I was a princess centurion.
Go ahead, Christopher.
On this question of your rabbinical authority, I'd also like to concede, because I would say that someone who says there's no afterlife has said they're not a Christian or a Muslim. And I have found it harder to make that sort of blanket remark about Judaism, even with Rambam's stipulation. It's not an optional thing. It's one of the things it's a mandatory belief. And even with your concession that when you were directly asked, do you expect to see your grandmother again, and you did what very few Jews will do and say, well, she's only metaphorical. I was once asked by the Spertus Institute in Chicago, which is the Jewish university, to give a talk on the question, do Jews have a gene for atheism? And I speculated. The majority of you seem to be yes. I mean, Jews do not make the mistake of saying the Messiah has already come, the crass mistake of saying that. Rambam himself says he will come, but he may tarry. No other religion does this. What's the name for a heretic in Hebrew? Epicurus. Epicurean. They teach people all the pitfalls of Greek philosophy and Hellenism, inviting them to discover the joys of saying. And ever since Spinoza, it seems to me that the Jewish people who probably ought to be doing this because it was their fault to invent monotheism in the first place, have become the first to transcend it. It can't be coincidence, can it? Just like people say it can't be coincidence so many Jews win the Nobel Prize. I'm serious. Spinoza, Marx, Freud, Einstein, it goes on. And it does seem to be latent in the Jewish demand to ask questions.
Yes, except
so and I'm very happy. It's much more of a pleasure to debate.
Maurice Samuel, who was a Jewish writer and thinker, said that the reason that the Jews continue to exist is that they refused to quit this world until they figured out what it was about.
Yes. And Leo Strauss says, very seriously, he said the purpose of the Jews is to show there's no such thing as redemption.
The challenge here is, again...
The pathetic Christian illusions are not worth entertaining.
You're invoking, I think, a name that for me suggests something very different. Spinoza called himself God intoxicated. And it is true that the God with whom he was intoxicated was very different than the literal God of the Bible, although he read the Bible as a political tract that had great relevance for his own time. He used it as a call for freedoms that his own community couldn't see or couldn't understand, and he had a notion of an afterlife. Again, very different than the kind of literalist read that I've heard of, but there is a tradition that goes back to the Talmud as well of rejecting that kind of literalism. Look, the whole rabbinic way of doing midrash, of reading biblical stories against the grain and filling in silences or creating extra, it wouldn't make sense if fundamentalism was the Jewish norm. And I also want to here stand up for the Buddhist traditions, which also talk about an afterlife, but in ways that some Western monotheists would find profoundly disconcerting. But there's a much broader notion, and I think it gets back to what Rabbi Wolpe said, that the notion that there is a meaning which we are capable of discovering, and that it's larger than, although embedded in our cultures, and that we have the capacity to live our lives in harmony with that. Look, for me, that comes in part out of evolution. Our brains have been 14 billion years in the development. Why would we not also trust the intuitions that we live in a universe that's moving towards greater complexity and greater relationship and greater connection?
Thanks.
It's basically Facebook is what we're talking about here.
So. Is there an afterlife on Facebook? Right. We have to wrap up, but I had I actually just had one small question, which is, Christopher, how are you feeling?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for asking. Well, I'm dying, but so are you. And it gives me the chance, thank you again, to repair what would otherwise have been an ungenerous omission when I was talking about the hateful attitude of so many religious people to sick people. I have had, very involved in my care, a great American, Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, and who's helped me sequence my genome amazingly, and possibly find a cure for an individualized mutation from which I suffer. Francis is one of the most devout believers I've ever met. In fact, I'm lucky to be his friend because of the religion debate. He's a very sincere and devout Christian, and all he does is say he won't pray for me. And all he does is say he's never seen in his entire medical career anything that he would describe as a miracle cure. And on that, we have one of the nicest armed truces it's ever been my pleasure to observe.
Thank you. That just proves debates like this could be life-saving.
But the short answer is it's a bit early to say. But who can't say that? No one's ever more than a breath away from the end. And we're born into a losing struggle. And we all knew that, or we should, from the beginning. It's just that I have to think about it a bit more. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I think I can say that for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the AGU. There you go.
Yeah. You liberals are slippery. It's true.